Exactly 5 years ago, on Holy Saturday, I was trying to get things set up for the Easter fire for the Easter Vigil Mass. And I was moving these big bricks alongside a metal shed that sat nearby the church. I was working in very close proximity to that metal shed, and unfortunately, at one point after setting a brick down and turning around too fast, I came into way closer proximity than I would ever want to be with a shed. Ended up hitting my head, splitting my eyebrow right open. You can actually see the line still. Knocking myself out cold and giving myself a concussion. Whole reason why I'm sharing this with you is because as a result of this head injury, I was told that I had to put down my phone, not use the computer, refrain from watching TV, not even to read. I had to rest my brain completely. Now, my guess is most of you know me well enough to know that sitting still and doing nothing is pretty much a nightmare. So after resting for a while, I decided to head to the chapel to pray in the rectory. And I was excited at first. I was like, oh yeah, there's this book that I've been reading. I can't wait to read it. And I picked it up, and before I even opened it up, I was like, oh, that's right, I'm not allowed to read. So I sat there and was simply present to the Lord. And I ended up having one of the best times of prayer I had had in a really, really long time. I felt an incredible sense of peace. And I realized that the reason why is simply because I was just present. And then suddenly the Lord put two things on my heart that both surround today's gospel. The first is that St. Thomas doubted that Jesus had risen. And the reason why was because he was not present in the upper room. Meanwhile, the other apostles who were present, they heard Jesus speak the words, "Peace be with you." They were able to experience peace, whereas Thomas didn't and couldn't, and the whole difference was they were present and he wasn't. Thomas went so far as to boldly claim, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and his feet and the wound in his side, I will not believe. Right? It seems like a really bold claim, but framed in the context of being present and encountering the risen Jesus, it makes perfect sense. Unless Thomas is present to Jesus, which allows him to see Jesus, it'll be hard to believe. The same exact thing is true for us. Unless we're present to the Lord and encounter him, we'll fail to believe. Here's where it all came together for me. I realized that I am physically present to God every day when I pray, every day when I celebrate Mass. But the thing that became so apparent when everything else was stripped away is that I let a lot of other things get in my way of being truly present to God, even if I might be present physically. Just like Thomas struggled to believe and was unable to hear Jesus say, "Peace be with you," because he wasn't present. We need to be present to the Lord. And as I say this morning, it's not just some little idea. It's something that all of us need to take more seriously, even more seriously, than I had to listen to my doctor's orders. The truth is, unless you encounter Jesus, see his wounds, it's hard to believe and our faith will remain on the surface. Now, there are all kinds of things that could be present in our lives that might keep us from being present to the Lord. My guess is if we all search our hearts honestly, we're pretty easily would be able to come up with things that are present to us that we put too much focus, time, and effort into that could hold us back from being present to the Lord. Now, unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go into all the possibilities that could keep us away from encountering the Lord and his peace, but I'm going to highlight one. And it's the thing that I truly think held Thomas back on Easter Sunday. That has to do with the reality of suffering in our world. Sometimes I know, I'll say for myself, and maybe for all of us, we can hold back and lack trust in God and not want to be so present to him because of our own wounds or the wounds that those who we love have received and endured. What we have to understand is that Jesus, God himself, was no stranger to suffering. That being said, if I were Jesus, I think that in the resurrection, after having gone through all the pain and suffering, having my hands and feet nailed to a piece of wood, I think that when I would come back with a glorified body, that I would do so without the wounds. I don't think I would want those scars. I would want to erase any and all memory of that difficult time, that event in my life that hurt so bad. But this, of course, isn't how Jesus thinks. And the reason why is because Jesus knows that every scar tells a story. Right? My guess is if any of you look at your bodies and you see different scars, be like, oh, yeah, that happened when this was going on. Oh, that happened here. Every scar tells a story. And Jesus' wounds tell a story of love. He didn't get holes in his hands and feet inside randomly. He got them as a result of pouring out his love for you and me. And think about this. It was Jesus' wounds that Thomas desperately wanted to see. Because those wounds would assure him that the man standing in front of him wasn't just some vision or some dream that would get his hopes up, but this was a man who had endured something and come out from it on the other side. Of course, know that a week later, Jesus appeared to the apostles again. And this time around, Thomas was there. And Jesus came right over to Thomas. And I want to make sure to point out this is the first time that Jesus is having a chance to talk to Thomas following not only his not being there on Easter Sunday, but following Thomas not being there for him at the foot of the cross, and then him doubting that Jesus was alive. And what does Jesus do? His first act towards Thomas is that he invites him to reach out and touch him, to see the scars, encounter him, and believe. Notice Jesus doesn't give up on Thomas. He doesn't say, Thomas, where were you? Why have you been doubting? He doesn't scold him. He doesn't reprimand him for doubting. Jesus does one thing. He has compassion on him and simply loves him. He continues to love because that's what Jesus does. And Thomas sees the scars. And in that moment, he knows. The scars are what assure him that he's loved. And Jesus says, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand. Put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And what does Thomas say? My Lord and my God. He believes. Not just because Jesus is appearing in all of his glory. He's believing not because Jesus is smiling at him. Not because he feels all warm and fuzzy inside. He believes because he sees the wounds and he knows the story that they tell. He knows that he's loved in that moment. That is why Jesus kept his wounds and chose to keep his scars. Now, Jesus' wounds weren't the only wounds and scars present in the upper room at that moment. I say that because in looking at Thomas himself, clearly he was a man who was hurt, who was wounded, who was confused. Just like all of us can be sometimes. All the other apostles who had abandoned Jesus at the cross, they had come back together 3 days later and were present and encountered Jesus when he appeared to them, having risen from the dead. Thomas wasn't present. Why do you think he wasn't there? I can't say with absolute certainty, because maybe it was his mom's birthday, so we had to be with her instead of with the guys, right? That's probably not it. I think it's safe to assume he wasn't there because his wounds hurt so bad that he felt so lost, so confused, and was feeling so much tension, like he was being torn apart, that he didn't know where to turn and he couldn't face it. So he wandered off on his own. And as he tried to figure it out on his own, he couldn't. And so the doubts and confusion swirled around and they consumed him. On his own, he had no way out from the depths of despair, distress, depression, and discouragement. What do we see happen? His brothers go out to find him. And then together with them, Jesus appears. The apostles who came in search of him represent the church. And you know what? All of us gathered here right now are truly a living family within this very same church. Whenever we struggle, whenever we are wounded, we have to come to Jesus and come to the church to be present. We need, in those moments, most to draw near to our brothers and sisters who believe so that they can help us to see and to believe. And what is it that they will help us to see? It's not that we don't have wounds, but they will help us to see that Jesus welcomes us and he longs to appear to us as we are with our wounds, so that he can show us his wounds and assure us that we don't need to walk this wounded journey alone, because he walked it first precisely so that he can show us the way. Just like Thomas, we need to ask Jesus to show us his wounds, to tell us his story of love. Here's what I think the whole event with Thomas boils down to. He said that he needed to see the wounds in Jesus' side. And I think he did so because he sensed that even if he eventually healed, that pain that he felt and the wounds and scars that he bore couldn't be taken away. He knew that they would always be a part of his story, that it would be impossible to go back to who he was or where he was before. And that Jesus, in letting Thomas see, touch, and feel his wounds, in a silent yet bold, certain, and very clear way, Jesus said so much to Thomas's heart. Here's what I think Jesus said to him in that moment. Just as I experienced something so painful, so raw, and so tense, that it could not have been endured on my own without the help of my loving Father, I know that you've endured a strikingly similar pain. And right now, I show you my wounds. Not just so that you might believe that I've made it through horrible hardship and still have life, but so that you can see that I'm glorified and that I truly, in fact, live with more splendor as a result of what I've gone through. Although the pain and the wounds hurt deeply, more deeply than anyone may ever know, those wounds didn't have the final word. I did not allow those wounds to have power over me. And I live now with more vigor, strength, and power than ever before. That just as you've endured pain as I have, that these scars and wounds that you see, they promise you that my power is made perfect in weakness. And although you can never go back to where you were before your wound, and you'll never be again who you were before your wound, that your life now, with your scars, because we're united and share scars in common, that your scarred life is more beautiful, more pleasing, more powerful, more capable of belief, and more capable and disposed to love than it ever was before. So know that your wound has not changed you, but because you accept my invitation, let me raise you up, it has transformed you. Because the only way that a heart can pour out its love is if there's an opening, if it's pierced. So stick your hand into my side and do not be unbelieving, but believe. Our wounds and our scars, if we cling to them and hold on to them and try to find healing for them on our own, it'll change us in a major way. It'll change us. We might never fully heal, and we'll be unable to go back to where we were before. But if we bring them to Jesus and allow ourselves to be fully present to God's divine mercy, and together with him, side by side, become aware of the fact that he rose from the dead, not by eliminating wounds and scars, but allowing them to be transformed by love, that our wounds don't just change us, they transform us. Let me pull it all together. Thomas wasn't able to experience the peace of Christ that he longed to give him because he wasn't present. And at the same time, he had doubts. And so from that point forward, the world has known Thomas as Doubting Thomas. And I think it is tragically unfair and inaccurate to call him this. I hate it when people call him Doubting Thomas. We could call him Hurting Thomas, Scarred Thomas, even Wounded Thomas. Or we could call him Believing Thomas, Faithful Thomas, Transformed Thomas, or my personal favorite, Saint Thomas. Because that's what the church calls him. And it's precisely what Jesus wants each of us to be called, even if we've had our moments of doubt, moments where we seem to be overcome by our wounds. Even if we have moments, for whatever reason at all, we find that we haven't been present to the Lord, even if we're physically present. I'll finish by saying that just as it would be false and inaccurate to call Thomas Doubting Thomas, so too it is false, inaccurate, and a flat-out lie if you ever view yourself and label yourself by your weaknesses, by your shortfalls and failings. You are not defined by your wounds and your scars, no matter how many you have, no matter how big they are. In the midst of your brokenness, Jesus invites you to be transformed. He invites you to reach out and touch the wounds in his hand and in his side, and to not be unbelieving, but believe. And what is it that you are to believe? That he's alive, that he's risen from the dead, that he bears a story of love for you in his very flesh, that you are loved in this moment just as you are. Wounds, scars, and all. and that if you present yourself to him, he will give you his peace. So reach out and touch the wounds in his hand and in his side, and do not be unbelieving,